Charlemagne said, "To speak another language is to possess a second soul." What he meant by that was that when you speak another language, you have another way of interacting with the world. You see the world from another perspective. We have this notion in America that language learning just is not important, that it's a box we have to check off for graduation, or everybody speaks English, so why should I learn another language? We believe that we can proficiently learn a language by playing games on an app in 10 minutes a day. And when we travel, many times a simple hello in the language of the country we are visiting goes a long way. But in my experience, many don't even do that. I am here today to help us shift our thinking on languages and learning languages. But first, I'd like to tell you a little story. This is my son, Daniel. Daniel is standing in front of his favorite place in the whole world, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Daniel can tell you anything you would ever want to know or not want to know about Notre Dame. He can tell you when it was built, how it was built, how many steps there are up to the bell towers, how many bells there are, the schedule of the bells, and the names of the bells. And yes, Notre Dame has names for every bell in the bell tower. Daniel is a bright, intelligent child. He can sing the entire score of Hunchback of Notre Dame in 3 languages. He loves performing and is extremely outgoing. But you see, there was a time when my husband and I were not sure that Daniel would ever speak, quote unquote, normally. And that's because Daniel is autistic. Just before his 3rd birthday, Daniel was diagnosed with high-functioning autism spectrum disorder. His language was not emerging as it should. He was not looking at us in the eye, and he was constantly crying. When he was diagnosed, I was told by a doctor to stop speaking French to him. As a linguist and a language teacher, I knew this was terrible advice, but I was also a scared mom who knew nothing about autism. So I backed off. I didn't stop completely, but I definitely backed off. Then I began watching the way in which the speech therapists worked with him. They were not only teaching him words, they were teaching him how to communicate, how to connect with other human beings, and how to get his basic human needs met. I started doing research. I wrote a thesis, and I based my entire national board renewal on this premise that language is human connection, and we cannot learn a language proficiently without human connection. Here's what my research found. First, we must change the way we think about language. Language is not simply words and grammatical structures, it is living. Language constantly changes and adapts to different parts of the world, to different time periods and generations, and to individuals themselves. We must make connection with other human beings in order to effectively learn a language and make a connection with the heart. Next, Students must be free to learn the language of their choice. Because language is about human connection, the choice to learn a certain language always starts with a connection, no matter how big or how small. A student may have a connection because an ancestor spoke a language or lived in a certain part of the world, or maybe a friend speaks that language. My son Daniel, who I mentioned just a few minutes ago, decided he wants to learn Dutch because there's a little boy at his school who speaks Dutch, and he's doing it. He's trying to learn Dutch. Next, and so important, we must eliminate translation. Translation means taking one word or phrase in one language and saying the equivalent in another language. Hello, how are you? Bonjour, comment ça va? That's translation. Translation must be eliminated for several reasons. First, it makes the speaker rely on his or her first language in order to speak the second language. It becomes a crutch. It causes frustration because we are constantly having to focus on accuracy and figuring out what we need to say accurately rather than communicating. Accuracy does not equal fluency. Fluency is the speed at which your brain processes and produces language. So, for example, if I were to use translation to purchase an apple at a market vendor in France, I might say, okay, I would like to buy an apple, and I have to think about it. Je would like, voudrais, to buy, acheter une pomme, an apple, s'il vous plaît, please. See how long that took me? Had I learned through a no translation method, I would know right away that simply saying une pomme, s'il vous plaît, is sufficient. Translation also gives us the instant gratification of understanding and understanding now. But how many times have I heard, I took 2 years of X language in high school and learned it through translation, and I don't remember a thing. It's because it doesn't stick in your brain that way. So we must engage our senses in order to make those connections in the brain. We must mimic how we learn our first language. Babies don't come out speaking, right? They come out listening. And they listen for years before they actually produce language. You need about 300 hours of just listening to language in order to speak fluently. 300 hours. The average high school student gets 120 hours, and that's only if the teacher is speaking French from the speaking the language, from the beginning of class to the end of class. 300 hours. Once we're listening, we also start to babble. We start to imitate sounds, and we start to repeat words. Only then does language start to emerge. So when we learn our second languages, or third languages, or fourth languages, we must imitate this process, because that is how our brains are wired to acquire language. Next, we must start earlier. We know that a young brain, the younger the brain, the more receptive to language. A baby as young as 6 months old can decipher between different languages. The average 15-year-old who's learning language in the United States will only learn 2 years of a language. By the time Europeans are 15 years old, they speak an average of 3 languages fluently, because they start at the average age of 3 years old. How does this work? How do we engage our senses? First, I listen. I spend as much time as I can listening to language. I put music on in the background. I watch a movie without subtitles. I just listen. And in my classes, we do a lot of listening in the first 2 years of learning language. Listening is key to acquiring fluency. Next, I sing, I dance, and I manipulate. I do an exercise in my classes called a clap snap, and you can do it with me if you want. I do this with all kinds of language: sentence chunking, verb conjugations, vocabulary. And this is how it goes. We're going to learn bonjour, comment ça va? Bonjour, comment ça va? This exercise will get faster and faster as we go through it. That helps the brain process and produce language more quickly. It goes like this. Bonjour, comment ça va? Bonjour, comment ça va? Bonjour, comment ça va? Bonjour, comment ça va? And then we get quicker and quicker with it. Not only that, but when you sing or put language to a rhythm, you are more likely to remember it because it goes straight into your long-term memory. Next, I draw. We draw pictures of sentences, of words, of grammatical structures, and while I'm drawing, I'm telling a story to my students, and they are drawing with me, and I'm giving them what we call comprehensible input. That is language the students can see and understand without the crutch of their native language. Next, I play. When we're having fun, we're more likely to remember something, right? So we play games, all sorts of games. And then I create. I'm not simply filling in blanks or regurgitating language that I memorized. We apply the language in a practical way that shows that we can use the language we have learned. What about smell and taste? I have one word for you: food. I don't know a language teacher out there who doesn't use food as part of the curriculum. Humans bond over food. Cultures all over the world have a traditional dish or some kind of practice that goes around the table at mealtime. It's linguistically rich. And food and the smell of food is tied to our senses and our memories. For example, I love European cultured butter. I love the smell of European cultured butter, and whenever I smell it, it takes me to my favorite cafe in Vichy, France, where I work several times a year. I put the cultured butter on a fresh baguette with some jam and dip it in my coffee in the true French way. I love that smell, and it has such a strong memory for me. We must make human connections. We must make connections with the heart in order to sufficiently and proficiently learn a language. Language is not simply a box we need to check off for graduation requirements. Language is an adventure And it is an important part of making the world a more harmonious place. Language is a voyage. It is an experience, the ultimate human experience. So I challenge you all today to go forth, engage your senses, and learn another language. Merci beaucoup.